Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, dear listeners. My name is Ronda Chervin, and sometimes I come on this show Thought You'd Like to Know, too. I also do other shows on WCAT. And I'm here today to introduce to you a wonderful book that's just been published by En Route Books and Media, the sponsors of WCAT Radio and TV. And the author of the book is a dear friend of mine and a mentor of mine, Hughes. And the title of the book is, listen to this, get this, Ice Fog, Spirit Fire, and the Narrow Gate, A Journey to Constant Joy. And what a title. Al is a Air Force lieutenant colonel, former, and also he was a pastoral counselor, and he's now a master spiritual director and many other things. And I can just say this is a very lively book with wonderful imagery, all sorts of adventure stories, and full of hope. So, before I put him on, I want to just mention titles of others of his books. And so, he wrote a book, Paradise Commander, about his time as a lieutenant colonel supervising for the Air Force in Antigua. And he wrote a book, To St. Jeannie's Shiny Black Shoes, about his deceased wife and her wonderful holiness. And one called Buddy, Can You Spare a Dime, D-I-G-M, Confronting the Apocalypse of Indifference. And this one, and then co-authored with me, Ronda Chervin, Escaping Anxiety Along the Road to Spiritual Joy, Simple Holiness, a 6-week walk on the mountain of God, and What Now, a roadmap for 80-year-olds. So hello, Al.
Good morning, Rhonda.
Yes. Could you tell us about what the title means?
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, when you read the title, it sent chills up down my back, by the way, but the way you said it. But, there are three elements here, ice fog, spirit fire, and the narrow gate. Ice fog, it really has three references. One is the reality of ice fog in central Alaska in the winter, which is where my wife and I, with our youngest, with our first child, lived for a year. I was on duty up there in Alaska. But also the chapter by the same name, Ice Fog, has a subtitle, Cloud of Unknowing, which is, of course, a reference to a very famous medieval spiritual writing. And third, Ice Fog really speaks to my state of mind at the time that we were in Alaska. I was an agnostic, had been, and I was now 33 in Alaska, and still from the age of about 30 on, I started worrying about, somewhere ahead of time, there's my death and oblivion, as I thought might well be the case. I was an agnostic. So I hit bottom that year, and I think we'll talk about that again. Anyway, so that was Ice Fog. Spirit Fire was part of, in fact, the most dramatic part of my conversion to Christ, because both my wife and I had the Pentecostal experience virtually identical to the beginning of chapter 2 in the Acts of the Apostles. It's the story of the upper room and the encounter with the Holy Spirit. My wife and I had that exact experience about a month apart, sometime later. So that's the Spirit Fire. And the narrow gate has to do with the essentials if one wants to be not only an ardent Christian but a holy Christian. So that's the three: Ice Fog, Spirit Fire, and the narrow gate.
Very good. Yeah, very good. So that's quite a journey. Well, I'd like you to tell us about growing up poor during World War II, because some of our listeners grew up after World War II, some 50 years after World War II, and they would be shocked to see how poor people were in the United States at that time. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. In the 30s, mid to late 30s, 1930s, of course, that was the time of the Great Depression. My dad was fortunate to have a job at all. He was making $40 a week, if you can picture that, and that was a good job in those days, but still poor. And this was before I was born. I was born, at the end of the Depression, of course, then we wound up with World War II with the Germans and the Japanese. And as there was no opportunity for most men, including my father, to really start amassing any kind of wealth at all, because now he comes out of the Depression and he goes right into the military, drafted. And then, of course, post-war, it took most of the late 1940s for the nation to recover and get back on a peacetime footing. And that's the environment I grew up in, was the late war and then the early 40s. I'll give you one image to describe what it was kind of like. We had this little ritual at supper time. We ate an awful lot of canned pork and beans, and that was kind of like 3 or 4 times a week. That was supper, and there was this little ritual. Was in the old? It's still that way today. The can of pork and beans has one little tiny piece of fatty pork in there, and the rest of it is just beans. So the game became at the dinner table at night, who was going to get the little piece of pork. And after several weeks of this game going on, I was old enough to think there was something not quite right here, because the parents never got the little piece of pork and beans. So I challenged my mother, and sure enough, she was managing the location of that little piece of meat so that one of us 2 kids would always get the meat.
That's so poignant. It reminds me, because I'm very much the same age as Al, and I remember precisely we always had pork and beans, and I remember trying to grab that little piece of pork. I remember that. So it was a very common experience. Now, in school, you had a particular experience, which is, feeling isolated in school. And since I've known Al Hughes for years, he's a mentor and he was in a writer's group of mine for years, I know that part of this is just always in school. If someone is extremely intelligent and above the level of the other students, he's going to be bullied and hated. So tell us a little about that, please.
Sure. First of all, in 46, I was attacked by a rabid dog, and because of reaction to the serum, I wound up at 5 years old. I wound up in a polio clinic, not because I had polio, but that was the only place they could treat me for rabies. I came right out of that and straight into, after 3 months in bed in that ward, polio ward, I went straight into first grade down in South Louisiana. Now, I'm very much an Anglo, and most people down there are very much French. So I had that going against me because I was somehow different going in. But more importantly, I was still thin and emaciated and constantly sick in first and second grade. And that set the stage for something of a disaster in the second grade, when a teacher announced at recess that everybody had to go to the back and play baseball. I had no idea what she was talking about, but I went back with all the other kids and really didn't know what was going on. I wound up out in right field, only because they pointed in that direction. I had no idea what was going on. And you can imagine I was pretty much a disaster to the baseball team that I was supposedly on. That went through 2 days, and then the third day I just couldn't take any more ridicule and shoving and pushing and name calling and all of that, because I really didn't know what was going on. I had never seen or heard of baseball. We weren't playing baseball in that polio ward, I'll tell you. So anyway, so after the second day of pushing and shoving and insults, I started hiding during recess, and for the rest of that year and on into the next year, I would hide in isolation, even though I was a strong extrovert. That set the stage, and all the way through even into junior high, other kids would not let me play on a baseball team because I had that reputation in their mind. So I lived in, other than schoolwork, I lived in pretty much in isolation. And as a child,
it's very important for you to know, because many people could identify with that, but even more, some people could identify with that, but even more is the whole thing about your dad being chronically depressed and clinically depressed, but in those days there was no diagnosis of such a thing. And just describe how you lived through with that.
Yeah, that was the other side of that same problem of isolation. Was my dad wouldn't help me or teach me to play ball or throw or catch or anything. Just wouldn't do it, and despite my mother's nagging. And so as a child, children are very good observers but very poor interpreters because they don't have the life experience to properly fully interpret what they see and hear and do. So as a little child, I made the decision that my daddy didn't like me because I probably was ugly, physically ugly. It was a decision I made, and that stayed with me all the way to age 26. And I only got past that when I finally realized that my new bride didn't think I was ugly. And so I was happy to assume, well, okay, maybe I'm not ugly, I'm just ordinary. And that got me past that. But that, of course, added to isolation as well, because all through school I had two reasons to stay away, to withdraw from social discussions and intercourse. Was I assumed I was ugly and that nobody was going to like me and they were going to reject me anyway. So that's called a bitter root judgment, by the way. The child makes a bitter root decision about himself, and it's always negative. And they forget that decision, but it's in their subconscious, and it affects their entire life if they don't find out about that bitter root that they carry.
Well, now we come to a more positive part of your life, which is your descriptions of being in the Air Force and what that was like. So could you tell us about particular work in the Air Force? Not too long, because I want to get to other aspects of your life even more. But, of course, many people who have been in the military will identify with this part of his story, which is very interesting.
Sure. I'll just stick to maybe the two most enjoyable and responsible jobs I had, three maybe. I went in as a second lieutenant and with a degree in electrical engineering, so I wound up first as a systems engineer and then as a manager of programs that we were developing some very classified special purpose radars. And I did that first at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base outside of Dayton, Ohio, and then more importantly, I spent 5 years at Cape Canaveral doing the same kind of work. Beyond that, I cross-trained over into Air Defense Command and wound up as Senior Director of the Space Defense Center as a brand new major. And that was great. That was wonderful. And I spent some time there and then on up to Alaska, which I've already mentioned with the ice fog. I was up there for just 1 year. Then back to a master's degree at the Air Force Institute of Technology, and beyond that, the second best job I ever had was a base commander at Antigua, West Indies, way east. Anything, if you went east of Antigua, you'd be in Africa, but, after crossing the Atlantic. It's way out there to the east. Wonderful job. Spent 2 years there.
The big thing that crashed into this whole list of things you did in the Air Force was meeting Jeannie, a Catholic, and his father. When he did talk to him, one of the things his father said to him was never marry a Catholic. His parents were agnostics and had no... Agnostic versus atheist. An atheist is someone who's convinced there's no God. An agnostic basically says we can't know. But anyway, tell us about meeting Jeannie.
Sure. While I was still at Cape Canaveral, I lived on a sailboat just south of the Cape, and one day this very large 45-foot-long catamaran comes in and docks next to my little boat that I was living on, and pretty soon, that was the Ed and Marilyn Bond on that boat with their youngest. They had four foster daughters. And after they got to know me, they were living on their boat too, their 45-footer, and after they got to know me, they brought one of the other foster girls back from Seattle to visit, and she stayed a few weeks, and I kind of ignored her, and she went away. I'm single, remember, and so then they bring the next one in, and now I'm suspicious that there's something going on here, and anyway, so I kind of ignored her, and after 3 or 4 weeks, she went away. Then Marilyn Bond started saying, Jeannie's coming to visit. You'll like Jeannie. And then I was sure there was a plan going here. They were trying to marry off one of their foster daughters. I immediately made arrangements to move to another city, another town, and another dock. But Jeannie showed up on that Tuesday just before I moved, and by Friday she was now living on the boat right next to us, right next to me in my boat. And so Friday I was gonna bail out of there and go somewhere else on Saturday, but Friday night I didn't have a date, so I said, well, hey Jeannie, you want to go out? Well, we went out, and turned out we went to a little nightclub. Turned out neither one of us liked to dance, so we started talking. And that conversation went on for 48 years.
I love that story. I happened to know Jeannie because she was a prayer leader, and I was part of her group, and she was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful woman. Okay, now, in the meantime, the book has all these scenes of sailing together, Jeannie and Al in the Caribbean, and it's very enjoyable reading with all sorts of amazing adventures of almost capsizing because the boat's coming an inch before hitting them veering away and things like that. It's very enjoyable reading. And so then you marry Jeannie, and she's a Catholic, and you have 2 daughters, Shannon and Catherine. And you do all sorts of work in the Air Force, in space defense, and all those things. And now you're on the island of Antigua. And tell us about this amazing conversion.
Sure. While I was in Alaska, I hit bottom, and psychological bottom, depression, I think. And so as an agnostic, I finally gave it a prayer. It was a kind of a is there anybody up there kind of a prayer, or to quote an old blues song, is you is or is you ain't, addressed to God if He's there. And so that was just a question, ask and ye shall receive is what I had read somewhere. And so 4 years later, we've gone from Alaska to the Caribbean, and the answer came in a most unusual way. I got up on on a relatively cool Saturday morning, and I was looking through the shutters of the bedroom onto the side yard, and it was just kind of a lovely morning, a little bit cool and very nice. And I said to myself, if there was a God, he'd make a morning like this. And immediately I heard a voice. I was by myself, but a voice, audible, said, "Why don't you pretend to believe and see what happens?" So I thought, well, now I thought that was a little bit extraordinary. So I said, well, maybe there is a God, and if there is, that's who that was, most likely. So I took the bait. I said, okay, I can, Jeannie's Catholic. I've been with her for 11 years now. I know how to do this. So I started pretending. And for 2 weeks, nothing happened. And I was praying every day and going to Mass with Jeannie and, whatever I could do to pretend to believe. And after 2 weeks, things started happening, a whole series of miracles. And it just went on and on and on and on for months. At first, almost daily miracles of one sort or another. And then it kind of tapered off to, 1 or 2 a week. And then, but it never has completely stopped.
Now the most spectacular miracle involves the rain and the birthday party. So tell them that in a little more detail. We have enough time.
Okay, good. So at the end of the 2 weeks, or during that 2 weeks, my wife was planning a birthday party for our eldest, who was going to be 6 years old at the time. And it was going to be an outside party, and my job was to take care of the outside operation, cook the hot dogs and feed the kids and rescue kids from drowning in the pool, that kind of stuff. While my wife and our maid were going to be inside doing the cooking and the rest of the cooking and clothing changes and all that, whatever, visitor direction. Big operation, but it was started raining. That was going to be on a Saturday, and the Monday previously it started raining, and it was monsoonal. It was just like you read about monsoons, and it was involved the whole Northeast Caribbean, of which we were right in the middle. And it rained and rained and rained Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. It was raining continuously, and I was praying, Lord, I don't really want to be bothered with that party, but let's do it for the children. And so that was my daily prayer, and it kept raining and raining and raining. And Saturday morning, just before the party, it was raining. So I gave it my last prayer, and I said, look, I had not learned respect for the infinite just yet. I said, look, the party's going to start at 1 o'clock. I need 2 hours for the water to run off the lawn and the time to set up. So I'm going to cancel the party if it doesn't stop raining by 11 o'clock. That was my prayer. Raining, 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 constant rain, just steady. And it was all over the Caribbean. The base forecast said that there would be no let-up for several more days after that. So we get down to 11 o'clock, my deadline, and we're standing at the screen door watching the rain, and I'm counting down 5, 4, 3, and I step out onto the porch, 2, 1, and just as at 0, at precisely 11 o'clock, I stepped out on the lawn and the rain stopped. Exactly on time, just as my prayer had requested.
But not all over the island, just around your house, right?
The rain was continuous, right up close and personal. Across the road was the Atlantic Ocean to the north, and then hills around us, and it was raining everywhere. You could see it, and it was right up to the edge of. We were living on a 5-acre plot at the time in Antigua, a little house, and it was raining right up to the boundary, all around us, in every direction and as far as you could see, but it was not raining on that 5 acres. And that went on all afternoon. The party was a great success. It was held on dry ground. There was the parents were coming and going. They were all in the rain where they were living, and they kept calling and asking Jeannie if she's going to cancel, and Jeannie kept telling them, no, it won't rain, bring the kids. very successful party. And it was, in the same prayer, I had said the party's going to last until 4:30. So at about 3:30, the kids were worn out, and the parents started coming and picking them up. And they're all standing out in the yard, and they're looking at the same thing I had seen all afternoon, this phenomenon, if you will, up in the sky. It was keeping the rain off our yard. And it was the clouds were splitting as they approached, the rain clouds. They were splitting, going around our 5 acres and recombining at the beach road just to keep our 5 acres dry. And that went on until precisely 4:30, and then the rain hit. Huge squall came roaring.
Listening to this, and you're thinking, you could be listening to this, and you're thinking, well, God never did that for me. Now, one of the things, I'm also a convert from an atheist background, and most atheists can't convert without some sort of big sign. And if you read the people who do convert from atheism, who write about it, it's usually something quite miraculous like this, because they're so used to being atheists that, they can never believe unless something spectacular happens. But other people, if you have doubts, it seems to me, a very good thing is to listen to lots of programs on WCAT, which have wonderful answers to questions of people who have doubts. But also, you can just pray to Jesus in any circumstance where you're feeling doubtful or miserable, and just say, do something to show me that you love me or that you exist. And he'll do something, but it doesn't have to be spectacular. It could be anything. I remember time in my own life, my best friend at the school where I was teaching, another professor, was dying. And I was feeling very low and thinking, I believe in life everlasting. I can even prove the immortality of the soul. We prove that in philosophy and Catholic philosophy and all this. I can prove that, but still I can't bear to lose him and all this sort of stuff. And I walk out of the hospital, and there's just one beautiful little daffodil sitting on the lawn of the hospital. And somehow the beauty of that daffodil turned me around. So God can use any tiny thing as a sign. One of the parts I liked especially, Al, was your description of the Mass in the Bahamas. How joyful this was, and, especially the part about the baby. So could you tell them that story?
Sure, yeah. This happened sometime later. We were back at Patrick Air Force Base, Cape Canaveral, for the third time in my career. And on a weekend, Jeannie and I sailed across to the Bahamas with a friend on his boat, and we wound up spending the evening at Marsh Harbor. On the eastern, near the eastern end of the Grand Bahama Bank, and that was on a Saturday. The next morning, we wanted to go to Mass, and so we went ashore, asked the dock master there if there was a church anywhere around, and he points to this black couple and their kids that were leaving, and he said, just follow them. They're going to church. They know where they know where it is. So he called to them and asked them to wait up, and so we joined this family. And so this is in real rough territory. It's lots of palmettos, a very few pine trees, and just scruffy kind of land. Anyway, so we join up with them, and we start walking up this road. And as we go, other couples and their children come out from side paths out in the wilderness there, if you will. And so our little group doubles and redoubles again. And within a mile or so, we were now a big crowd as people kept joining us from side paths along this shell road. And till we got to the church. But on the way, they were singing, and particularly the children were dancing, and it just got to be like a festival going up the road, and getting bigger and bigger as other families joined us. And so we eventually got to made a right turn off this gravel road, and there's a little church in a clearing there, very bare wood, bare everything. And so we go to mass there, and the interior was just like the exterior, unpainted, poor, just boards, dry boards, benches, unpainted benches. The only paint in the place was a trace of paint that once had been on the altar. Anyway, so just as we're there, and you can picture, they had opened the shutters. There was no air conditioning. This is no electricity for that matter. And so we're sitting there, and when we get to the homily, this baby to our right starts crying. And this little church is now packed with people. And so to stop the baby's crying, the mother hands the baby to the person on her left, who then turns and gives the baby to the next person. And that baby went all over the church, person to person. We even held the baby for a little while, and the baby quietened. After about 2 passes, the baby quietened, just fascinated to see changing faces. And so the homily went to completion without any interference at all, and eventually the baby wound up back with its mother.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful see. Some people claim that our church, the Catholic Church, is maybe some of you listeners who are not Catholics think that isn't friendly. Well, that's partly because most of us live in big cities where the church has, people don't know each other. And in the original early church, you can't imagine groups of Christians who didn't know each other by name and were friends with each other and all that. So that's part of the difficulty. But, of course, there are different ways we try to overcome that. But, of course, some Catholics are so used to coming to Sunday Mass but not mingling with the other people that they don't like to sit around drinking coffee and getting to know other people. And then they accuse us of being unfriendly. But it really is a wonderful, wonderful church. And you can, if you want to, you can make friends with wonderful, holy people who will help you grow in holiness. So now, I want you to tell us, Al, about your progress through this whole thing of unconditional obedience and what that experience was after when you decided, when God told you something that you didn't want to do, and what followed from that.
Sure, yeah. Let's see. I had mentioned that at Antigua, right after my initial conversion, or shortly after, Jeannie and I both had this Pentecostal experience. And she first, and then me about a month later, and it was identical to chapter 2, Acts of the Apostles, and it was just like that. And so we just got together after my experience, and we're talking, and we decided that there's only one thing that made sense after such clear revelation of the presence of God in our lives. We both took a vow. We didn't go to church to do this. We just took a personal vow, joint vow, of unconditional obedience. Unconditional obedience. And then in the meantime, there were various miracles going on in our lives, and that just continued on until we left Antigua and even beyond, including a lot of them that there were too many to put in one book. But lost my track here.
No, the thing is, okay, how you were tested on this unconditional obedience.
Okay, got it. Yeah, of course, yeah. So 3 years went on by, and we transferred out of Antigua, and we wound up back at Patrick Air Force Base for the third time. And I was running the long-range planning shop for the Eastern Test Range, ballistic missile range, and I got to the 20-year point, which was the minimum time for retirement, and I thought I probably should retire, but I really didn't want to retire. I loved the Air Force. I had a great career going, and I was well respected in my niche that I had of planning, technical planning for test ranges, which I had established myself as an expert in that field. And I was, they wanted me, and I wanted to be there, and yet there was this feeling, if you will, that I really should retire now, and not. I could have stayed on for another 8 years. So I typed up a letter of resignation and a request for retirement, and my secretary wasn't there that day, so this is before PCs. I typed up my letter on her typewriter, and then I'm sitting at her desk, and I turn and I put my feet up on the desk, and I'm looking at this letter, and I'm asking myself, kind of out loud, I said, Al, are you really going to sign this? This letter of resignation? I sure didn't want to do it, and I think I wasn't going to do it, frankly. But the phone rings on her desk, and I pick it up, and it's my secretary from the previous base, Marion, her name, Bowser, Marion Bowser. I still remember her name. Anyway, so we have a normal chit-chat, and, how's old Gus, and how's old Bob, and, that kind of stuff, and how's the weather, and, oh, it's cold up there, but it's warm down here in Florida, that kind of stuff. And she's talking, and in the middle of a sentence, her voice drops an octave. Now, remember, I was still sitting there looking at this letter while I was talking to her. Her voice dropped an octave, went masculine, and he said, I know you're trying to make an important decision, and I want you to go ahead and do it. And then her voice went right back to normal. And I said, Marion, did you hear that? She said, what? And I repeated it, what had happened. And she says, oh, my God. And I said, yep, I think so. So we finished the conversation. I hung up the phone, and I signed the letter against my will, on my own will, because we had vowed obedience, and I was not going to change my mind about that.
Well, I want to just make a point here because people could be confused. You never obey any voices that tell you to do something evil. You never
That's
do
correct.
Something morally wrong because you hear a voice. See, like, you don't say, well, a voice told me I should have an abortion, or a voice told me I should kill my husband or something. That can never be from God. But when you're choosing between two good things, then you have a right to choose either one, but you can decide, I want to do what God's perfect will is, not what he might permit me to do. So there would be nothing wrong with staying on in the military from a moral point of view, but if you want to totally be in line with God's perfect will, then if you hear a voice like that, you would naturally do it. Yes.
What happens is once you enter the spiritual world, and that's where Jeannie and I wound up through our experiences, once you enter the spiritual world, you are subject to more than one voice. There are other spirits out there beside God, and so you have to discern if you're getting a voice or an inclination even that without a voice, you have to discern where's this coming from. And it's pretty easy to do, actually. There are 3 or 4 rules you can follow. First of all, does the suggestion that you're receiving, does it lead to something good or something evil? Second of all, is it consistent with Scripture? And then third of all, you can ask, is it consistent with the teachings of the church? And then there's also St. Peter's rule, where he said, by their fruits you shall know them. In other words, if the fruits of what you're being of the suggestion or voice is suggesting something that would lead to really holiness, then fine. But if not, then don't listen to that voice. You have to be a little discerning about these things if you enter the spiritual world.
Now, so even though you felt pretty depressed when you decided to retire, he has a whole section about that. But tell us what you went on to see that where God was leading you, not in detail, but just a little bit about RCIA, OLCC, and you can unpack those abbreviations for us. And
Sure.
What you mean by this road to spiritual joy. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are, the letter that I signed to resign, requesting retirement, was dated to take effect the end of May, and I wrote that sometime during the winter. So the clock is running down, and I'm really depressed because I don't want to leave, but I'm being obedient. And so we get down to about March, I guess it is. And, of course, the D-Day for me was the end of May. And that's the departure date, if you will, from the Air Force. And I get home from work, and Jeannie said right at the door with this little religious magazine. I don't remember what it was. But anyway, she says, "Here, read that." And she said, No, not that. Read that little ad there. And it was an ad. Now, remember, we're in Florida. It was an ad from Seattle University suggesting a master's of pastoral ministry. And I looked at that and I said, gee, I wonder if that's what God wants us to do, post Air Force. And so to make a long story short, it was exactly what I was supposed to be doing. And I was accepted and given a very minor bit of tuition assistance, and I had the GI Bill coming and a retirement check. So that seemed to be it. And so when the day came and I had to leave the Air Force, we bought a motorhome and spent the summer traveling all back and forth, zigzagging across the country, so that we would, by the end of August, we'd wind up in Seattle.
Well, and that's where I wanted to mention here, just to break in for a minute, is many listeners might not know this. There are positions in the church, in parishes especially, because the shortage of priests. The same priest can't be saying 5 masses on Saturday and Sunday, mass every morning, confessions, marriage prep, all different kinds of things, and also do introductions to the faith for possible converts, ministries going with the Eucharist to the sick. There are all kinds of things. And what's been happening in the church is that people who are retired, who are not in wheelchairs yet, or some even in wheelchairs, will do some of this wonderful ministry, and this is called pastoral ministry. I mean, it could be a young person too, but a lot of retired people get into pastoral ministry. Now, if you're a trained minister, pastoral minister, then that's even better, because then you know how to teach the faith to adults who are coming back to the church maybe, there's all different aspects of pastoral ministry, especially a part that Al got into big time, which is pastoral counseling. And this is where people can come to you with their problems. And so maybe give us a couple of highlights from that period in your life, because we don't have too much time left.
Right, yeah. We got to Seattle, and I started this program as a master of pastoral ministry, and there was a practicum attached to it, which I chose. There were 50 choices. I picked this one. It was since I was a convert, the church in that day had started a program called RCIA, Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, and it was a program for teaching converts. So that seemed like a natural. I'm a convert, and I could teach others who are curious about the church. So I took that practicum, and then moved on after that year at Seattle University. But I spent the next 25 years founding and running a program, RCIA program. So I was teaching some theology, a lot of scripture, and beginnings of what would later become spiritual direction on my part as I developed.
Very good. So this book details a lot of wonderful things that Al did, and this was before he started writing books, as his last vocation was writing all these wonderful books. Could you say a word about that idea of the narrow gate, which is in the title?
Sure. The narrow gate, Jesus in Scripture, and it's, I think I wrote the location. Oh, yeah, Matthew 7:13 is where Jesus talks about the narrow gate. And he's actually discussing the opportunity to pursue holiness. Now, he doesn't say it in those words, but that's what it really is. And he says, come by way of the narrow gate. Come by the way of the narrow gate. For the gate is wide that leads to disaster, and many take it. So what is the narrow gate? And Rhonda and I, in one of our books that we work together, we've written a book on that subject. It's Simple Holiness is the title of that book, about the narrow gate. The narrow gate turns out to be very simply, the gate is called, its name is charity. Narrow gate is called charity, and it has two hinges, humility and obedience. Now, we've been talking mostly about obedience in this current book, but obedience first requires humility, authentic humility, not the church doormat type, but authentic humility, which leads to obedience, which leads to charity, which is the gate. When you open that gate with authentic charity toward others, then you begin to climb the mountain of God, as the metaphor goes. So that's the narrow gate.
I have a nice example to give because it impressed me very much. When I was living near Al Hughes in Corpus Christi, Texas, I found out that he wasn't boasting about it. He just happened to mention it, that when he goes for a long walk on the beach every morning, that when he sees street people, or people like in doorways, who live in doorways, that he goes up to them and talks to them and gives them help and really befriends them, see? And that's way out of obligation, because people can just say, oh, all these people are, drug addicts, who knows what they're going to do with the money, all like that. And thereby we kind of absolve ourselves of helping anyone except our friends. But we should be, in whatever way we think is legitimate, we should be helping the poor. So there are many facets to this life. A story. Now, I think it would be a great book. This book would be a great book to give to men readers for this reason. that many men don't like the feminine way of describing their lives, our lives. I know that from long experience. I mean, I've written many, many books, and most of the books that are autobiographical or memoir-type books, women like better than men. They would rather read about a man who had been in the military and who had been in the Caribbean in a sailboat than read about my motherhood or something. So you could give it to someone like that, especially someone who's either doubting or an atheist or an agnostic. That would be a wonderful thing. But just you could enjoy reading it yourself. And this is published by En route Books, which you can click back on your computer from WCAT Radio back to En route Books. And you can get it at Kindle for $9, and as a paperback for $14.95. So I highly recommend it, and I think listening to Al Hughes' little highlights from that book will give you an idea how interesting it is. So would you say a prayer for closing, Al?
I think we've got a few more minutes.
It doesn't matter when we end the show.
First, I would like to mention that the key to everything that's happened to my wife and I started with that vow of unconditional obedience. Unconditional obedience leads eventually to unconditional charity, and unconditional charity leads on to unconditional, sustained, constant joy, which is the end of the title, A Journey to Constant Joy. That's just the way it is. Obedience leads to charity, leads to joy. There's a very critical line in John chapter 14 that addresses the importance of obedience, and it's for John 14:21, and it's Jesus who is speaking, and he says, "They who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me." Now, right there, he's already defined what it means to love God. I think anyone who's a Christian will say, the essence of Jesus' teaching is to love God and your neighbor as yourself. And we know what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves, but how do you love God whom you can't see? And most people, when they hear the word love, they think of emotion and devotion, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not what Jesus says. He says love is based on obedience. Those who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me. That's his definition of love of God, obedience. And those who love me, in other words, those who obey, will be loved by my Father, and I will love them, and here it is, and reveal myself to them. If you're complaining that God never has revealed himself to you, then my question is, are you being unconditionally obedient?
Now,
it's right there.
See, that can sound very vague to people, Al. But if you think of some of the things that Jesus said, for instance, he says, in Jewish religion, you were supposed to not get angry at people and unforgiving. But he says, if you even call someone fool, you're in danger of hellfire. Well, how many times do you talk about other people and say what a foolish idiot so-and-so is? He says, if you have luxuries, give them to the poor. Well, how many things you have that you don't even know where they are in your cluttered cabinet? See, so, obedience isn't something vague. There are all kinds of things. If you read Scripture every day, you'll see with an ideal of obeying what you read that Jesus says. Now, you need good advice not to do, it doesn't mean everyone has to have only one coat and no sandals. You have to, interpret things that can't interpret everything literally. But just the same, it's very good to talk to friends who you consider to be holier than yourself and ask them, where do you see I might change to be more obedient to Jesus? And so, as a closing prayer, dear listeners, we love to read about people who have found you when they were lost in the world, and they found you and how you changed their lives. And especially we love to think that we could be more joyful if we followed you more closely through the narrow gate. So please take our hands and walk us through that narrow gate on the road to spiritual joy. And thank you, Al, for coming on this program. I thought you'd like to know. Amen.
Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.